Welcome, Adrian Gates, to this episode of Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. This season is all about implementation of investigative interviewing, and we're going to talk about both the near and the far horizons. And thank you for being our guest today.
Well, thank you, Ivar. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm a fan of your podcast, and I have listened to many very esteemed academics and practitioners. So I count myself very lucky to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
So do I, Adrian. And to our listeners, they might not know you as well as I do. So could you give a short introduction of who you are, where you come from, and what you currently occupy with?
Absolutely. Well, I'm no longer in the police, which in Ireland is An Garda Síochána, means the guardians of the peace. I joined originally in 1999. I went into the Garda Training College in Templemore, and it takes about 15 months before you become operational. And then I went out to a busy Dublin city centre station called Pearse Street, and we had very little training on interviewing or investigations, so a lot of it was based on what I saw and who I happened to be with on any particular day. During my time in the police, I was sent to a busy Dublin station in Swords, and within three and a half years, I was part of a crime task force where we spent 2 years driving around the north of Dublin City in response vehicles, and it was, I guess it was every man's dream to do this work. Following this, I went pretty much into a detective unit. So it was a local detective unit where I spent a number of years investigating crime, everything from crime ordinary to sexual assaults to murder. And it was in around the year, I think it was 2014, that I realized that interviewing suspects and witnesses was something that I was very interested in and quite good at. So I felt. At the time, there was definitely, as you would describe, or as Eric Shep would describe, a cloth culture, whereby our whole plan was to get someone to confess, because we felt that, if somebody had been arrested and a suspect was in front of us, we automatically assumed that they were guilty. So we engaged in what's known as bias or confirmation bias, and we went looking for information that suited our case theory or hypothesis. But as time went on, I realized that I wasn't very skillful, and those around me weren't very skillful. So I started to look elsewhere and to kind of dip into the world of academics, and I found a book by Becky Millen and Ray Bull called Investigative Interviewing, and I read the book and it made a lot of sense. Another book called Conversation Management by Eric Shepard and Andy Griffiths, and having read both of them, I decided that it was time that I went back to study. I had a previous degree in business and management, but I went studying in the University of Portsmouth with Professor Becky Millen, who thankfully has been my mentor ever since. It was funny. I was invited over by Becky to a conference, and I entered the room, and you were sitting there. So I'm this young guy from Ireland who is a detective and has a burgeoning interest in investigative interviewing, but really didn't know what he was talking about. He had read a couple of books and looked at a few bits and pieces online. But I think that was my first real introduction to you, Ivar, and my first academic argument, because what you were saying at the time was very alien to me, because you were saying that everybody has the right to silence or to say what they want to say or say nothing at all, and it's not up to us to make them talk. I guess what you were alluding to at the time was the operationalization of the presumption of innocence. And my counter argument was, well, what about the victims of these crimes, and what about their families? And again, as I was talking, I think I was fully sure that I was saying the right things, because in my mind, the job of police were to find person who committed a crime and to find information to make them confess. When I look back on that meeting, that's just over 10 years ago, it's quite embarrassed to think that that was the way that I thought. But
That's
that
so
is the
funny.
way, that is the way that I picked it up from everybody else. And, you know, it's funny because I would have been almost, you know, taken out and asked to interview certain types of interviewees, whether they were suspects or witnesses or victims, because I was always thought to be, you know, quite gentle in my manner and the way I speak to people, and I think at the time that my own superiors realized that I was actually good at, dare I say it, gathering information. But I did have that bit between my teeth. I was always acutely aware that there would be a question at the end of the interview to ask me, did you get it? Did you get it? You know, the confession. And we always felt a little bit like a failure if we didn't. And I guess that was just something that was historic and culturally ingrained into us. Look, from that, I went on to complete the master's, and I did a study with Becky Millen on the Garda Síochána interview model, which is a model, that investigative interviewing model that we use in Ireland. This came about originally in about 2010. There was some original training, and then HQ Directive 20 of 14 came out in 2014, and it began to roll out. It's a model that is quite similar to the peace model in the UK. Has the same kind of phases. You know, you plan and prepare, your first contact, rapport, which actually is the engage and explain in peace. Then you have your account of knowledge, assess, corroborate, challenge, and your closure. So it was based on peace, but I was sent down on a course just over 10 years ago, and I think at the time, those who were running the course were a little bit wary of me because of my connection with Becky Millen. I have to say that it was my detective sergeant at the time, Adrian Murray, who was a real mentor to me, and he's become a very good friend who ensured that I got down on the course. And there was a sergeant called Marianne Cusack, and she did a lot of work to bring the process on, because, as you know, Ivar, it's a lot of these things that are driven from the bottom and sometimes driven by one or two people. It was Geraldine Noon who was really behind coming up with the model originally. And after Geraldine left, Marianne then stepped in as the sergeant in charge of investigative interviewing to keep that moving. And then I was brought in as a trainer, and then I became the lead in Ireland on investigative interviewing training. And I was then moved into something called the National Bureau of Criminal Investigation, which is NBCI, which is a national detective unit that specialised in serious and complex crimes throughout the entire country of Ireland. And at the same time, I was working almost hybrid. I was spending probably half of my time teaching and lecturing in the Garda College with regard to investigative interviewing, and the other half I was in interviews. So it was absolutely, from a development point of view, it was excellent, and it gave me a really excellent opportunity to see what we were doing in the field compared to what we were doing in the training. I was subsequently then promoted to the rank of sergeant, and I took over from Marianne Cusack as sergeant in charge of the investigative interviewing section in the Garda College. And it was here and then that I realised that we did have a lot of work to do. A lot of the work we were doing was based on the results of my master's studies with Becky. I think there are huge parallels here with you, some of your colleagues. Right, Cliff, isn't it? That I know you both went to the UK and you did your masters and came back and brought a lot back. This was slightly different because it was very different because the model was already in place. But there were certain findings, that were really sticking out. And one was the lack of ongoing training and supervision. Within the actual peace model, there was an evaluation phase, whereas there is no evaluation phase within the GSIM. It was implicit. there is a standalone rapport phase within the GSIM. And I still think that it causes problems. And my findings showed that I looked at real life interviews, and the standard of rapport building was quite poor. It was perfunctory a lot of the time, which is in keeping with a lot of the research that has taken place. A lot of the interviewers seem to view it as a stage, which unfortunately it is depicted as within the model. It translated to interviewers building rapport for the sake of building rapport, because that is part of a model and part of a stage. And then it was almost like Jekyll and Hyde, because once they got to a certain stage that they felt was the challenge phase, well, then Dr. Hyde came out, or was it Jekyll? And the report stopped, because they felt that they had done the report, and they then moved on. But that was one of the areas that we found was really lacking. And another area was the lack of understanding of the cognitive interview, the enhanced cognitive interview, and how that was run. The training used to take place over 1 week. So the advanced interview course on level 3 was 3 weeks. It was 2 weeks suspect and 1 week witness. So with Becky, I identified that the training really needed to be looked at, and Becky brought me over to the UK, and I did some training with her and observed a number of sessions she did with police organisations in the UK. And I came back to Ireland and said, look, we need to change how we do this, because this is not cognitive interviewing. And even in how we train it, we're giving a false scenario that someone reads and pretends to be an interviewee, and then you're teaching somebody to deal with a witness, to help them become comfortable, and then to access parts of memory that don't exist because they weren't real memories. So we changed how that happened, and we started to use simulated crimes. So we gave real memories. Okay, they're memories of simulated crimes, but
still real, yeah.
Still real. And at this stage, there has still been no enhanced cognitive interview ever done in Ireland. And I remember one day calling Becky and saying, Becky, the legislation supports this. I'm going to do one. So we had a local case where it was an attempted abduction of a young lady, and I was explaining to my detective sergeant, I'm going to do this. This is what I want to do, and I'll be alone in there, and this is how I do it, and this is how I teach it, and this is how it's supposed to be done. And he gave me the go ahead, and I remember clearly going through all the bits and pieces, and it was a really old interview room, and I was building up to this, and I was bringing it into the whole area of context reinstatement. The interview was not nice and relaxed, and next the door burst open, and I jumped and she jumped, and someone was holding a cup of coffee and said, "Oh, geez, very sorry about that," and then they shut the door again, and I thought, this is finished. This is not going to happen. But we got it back on track, and when I handed it over to the witness, I sat back, and Ivar, she spoke for 32 minutes uninterrupted. I didn't think it was possible.
Amazing.
And then when other people started, it started to circulate what had happened, what was possible. The amount of information that came out was just incredible. I started to become more and more popular. I started to gain a little bit of credibility, and I was invited to do little seminars around the country, and I would go from stations to divisions to districts, and I was making, I guess, quite a name for myself, which is something that I never wanted. That was not what it was about, because, as you know, detectives, investigators, it's quite. Let's be honest and say it's quite a sexy position, isn't it? That everyone wants to be the detective, and certainly now that this was a relatively new area of investigative interviewing. That was, at the time, people believed it was a mixture between psychology and black magic. That you had this air of, how would I explain it? That when we went to police stations to do level 3 interviews with level 4 interview advisors, we had this aura around us whereby people just wanted to. It was like everybody wanted to know how they could do this and get on the course and become part of this new movement, But for me, there were always alarm bells at this. And I felt sometimes that the wrong people were coming down. There's one particular conference springs to my mind. I went with a legendary detective sergeant called Peter Woods, and he's not long retired. And Peter was a really, really good interviewer and a really good guy. And he was involved with the training when I went on the training. And he would have had a lot of credibility because he would have dealt with some very, very high profile cases. It was a really rainy afternoon, I remember, and we went in, and the assistant commissioner, chief superintendent, detective chief superintendent, who was over the MBCI, which I was at that point a part of, and everybody was there to watch the various talks on different parts of policing. And then Adrian Gates got up to do his talk on the ECI, or the Enhanced Cognitive Interview. I went through it, and as I always like to start with, by creating a false memory. And I had this chart, and I could see them all looking at it, and I say, I can pretty much guarantee that half of you will remember words that you didn't even see. And we went through the whole process, and it worked as it always did. And I could see, even my chief at the time, he was looking, and he was if he wasn't impressed, he was certainly amused. But the talk came to a finish, and I was answering some questions, but one particular hand went up of a detective superintendent, and he said to me, and I'll never forget it, Ivar, he said, "Adrian, are you telling me that we've been doing it wrong all this time?" So I had to think about it. And the one thing I never lacked was courage, and the ability to say things that need to be said. I could have spent maybe 2 or 3 minutes going into reasons why it was always done the way it was and how new information has come available, but I simply said yes. A number of them nearly fell off the seat. Someone thought it was very amusing. Some didn't think it was very amusing at all. And I was thinking, well, that's the chop for me. That's the end of it for me. But it wasn't. It wasn't. And I went on to do a number more of these ECIs in the field, real life ECIs, and we began teaching it the right way. Becky Millen came over, and she did a train the trainer, and she trained 8 of us, and it took off from there. And there was one, there were a number of cases that took place. One particular case whereby there was a brutal killing of a man in Dublin. I was quite happy working away, and I took up further study with Becky. And I've almost completed my professional doctorate, where we're looking at the evidential records of interviews with suspects and how accurately they reflect interviews that take place.
That's a fascinating story, and I have to say, it's just amazing to hear. I have to say also, there are certain points here where I really feel we've been down the same path, and that courage it takes to promote that kind of fundamental change in something that is so seen as such a basic task.
I knew one of the questions you were going to ask, or that you may ask today, was about, I think, if I remember correctly, the ethos of investigative interviewing.
Correct, because we were talking now, you've been walking around it. You have been talking about the first research-based interview method, which is called the enhanced cognitive interview. But what would you say, if you could elaborate a little bit on the ethos of investigative interviewing?
I'm happy to answer this, and it shouldn't be a simple answer. 10 years ago, for me, it would have been a very simple answer for you, Ivar. I would have said it's about respect and empathy and building rapport and being honest, isn't it? Isn't that what it's about? But one of the reasons that I wanted to finish the professional doctorate, and I feel very, very strongly about this, and this is something that you've actually influenced. And I think you would agree that we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, of the likes of Tom Williamson and Ray Bull, and
Absolutely.
one that came in before us. But for me, the ethos of investigative interviewing has to be, again, I'm repeating something you've said often, but it's operationalizing the presumption of innocence. It can't start off from anything more or less than that. Because if you, as an investigator, are protecting the presumption of innocence, and you presume that the person in front of you is innocent, well, then everything changes. you don't go in with particular case information or a mindset, and you don't go chasing information that suits you or the case theory. And if that's where we start, you can call it what you want, but there's a huge mindset shift required to achieve that, because talking is very cheap. And I've seen it. And as the sergeant in charge of the investigative interviewing section, I looked at hundreds of interviews. And I actually, there was no formalized process for assessing in a pre-assessment who would come in. So one of my ideas was a training passport whereby you would submit an interview with a suspect and with the corresponding statement. And I looked at those, and that filtered into my prof doc research. But I could see it. I could see that people that I had personally had trained and had watched. We had an interview pre-training. I had the interview directly after training in college. And then there was one more required each year to hold on to your certification. But the interview that we got back from the field was so different and so contrasting to the ones that were done under let's say, supervision within the college. And you have to remember that the interviews that they're sending back were probably their best, what they felt were their best.
I guess.
Interviews. And to say that some of the interviewers reverted back to type is an understatement. So it goes back to what is investigative interviewing. It is that presumption of innocence and understanding that, because if you don't have that and you don't have the adequate shift in mindset, it is, I know, a huge paradigm shift. I think a lot of the training is actually wasted.
I think you're so right. It reminds me of a couple of years ago, we were fortunate enough to be invited to Fiji in the Pacific to train. And the New Zealand police had been introducing the peace model to them over several years, but they say it just doesn't stick. They don't seem to get it. And we came down, of course, we had a long and good rapport building with the Kiwis, not to kind of come in any competition or conflicts. But I think definitely what they had missed out is that this is something much more than just a stage model. And if you just deliver that stage model, well, does it really make a change? And what is really the change? What we saw in Fiji is that Fiji is a really tribal community, extremely religious. So everything was kind of seen as sin, even just a suspicion of having done something. So punishment started even before the interview. So they beating up someone just because they had become a suspect was almost seen as a duty of an elder who down there. So when we started to talk about what you say, presumption of innocence, and how easy it is to go into these paths and cultural, I think it's very cultural and historical. That was so interesting to see in Fiji. And I think that you're so right. It aligns very well with my experience that you have to talk about these fundamental things. What are we actually trying to protect or to strengthen? And why did investigative interviewing come about in the first place? It was because they had loads of miscarriage and a loss, wrong people convicted, a cultural presumption of guilt. Fundamentally, but it was brought in to change something. So yeah, I think that's you're probably the first guest this season that I've said that, and I couldn't agree more. If you come in with that mindset, of course, that will impact all of the phases and the whole interview and the whole relationship.
I was involved in an interview, a very high-profile interview, and it was quite an emotional time as well, because it was with regard to the shooting and killing of one of my colleagues, one of our colleagues, whose brother worked with me and was my partner at the time. And I moved on. Ultimately, I was involved in the investigation, and I spent a lot of time with one of the suspects. I had to get myself checked a couple of times during the interviews in terms of how I was doing, and it was an incredible level 4 called Detective Sergeant Adrian Murray, who was able to check me as we went. He was giving me feedback on my performance. He was telling me to slow down at times, various things. He was helping me to manage my performance. And this is something that wasn't all that common. At times I wondered, and I've said this to him, I'm the national lead here. I know how to do it. But I was getting caught up. But you mentioned something, Ivar, about how it affects everything throughout the interview. Well, I did a number of interviews, and at the end of that interview, the person in question shook my hand and went their way. And about 4 months later, I was walking in my hometown with my wife and 3 kids, holding 2 of their hands. They're only young boys, and the same person came walking down the same path. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and we both recognized each other. And he just simply nodded. And I think that's a good reflection of somebody who was looking to gather information as opposed to conclude if someone was guilty or not guilty. Because by doing that, I was able to maintain a relationship. And as you said a few minutes ago, what is it we're trying to achieve? And I think if you can look at that and in introspection realize that what I was trying to achieve was as much information as was possible, to gather as much information as was possible. And that's where the real idea of rapport building comes in, to build relationships and to mean it. And to mean it that you want to build a relationship doesn't mean that I have to like the person or they have to like me. What it should mean is that I don't start talking about things that they're not interested in or that I'm not interested in for the sake of a rapport phase of an interview. I might start talking about the football on the weekend or something like that. That's not what it was about. So for me, that nod of the head was, it said a lot.
That's really a tribute. And there are, I think, when we work with the stuff that we do, we become cynical over time. And a very serious thing that we detectives do every day is to accuse people. And I think if you transfer that to daily life, in normal life, family life, relationships, friendship, imagine how rarely we actually accuse someone, and what impact that might have on a relationship. And we do it every day. And it becomes like bread and butter. And I think we get too used to it. We don't really understand. Many people don't understand what that really mean to the people on the other side of this table.
Yeah, massively so. You may remember a story I told you before about a friend of mine, too quickly. It was christening day of my middle boy, and they're all up in the house, and the party finished, and all the guests had left, and I was bathing my son. I don't know if you remember this. And I had an Apple Watch on at the time, and the phone rang, and I thought it was odd because this person was getting a bus back to Dublin. And I decided to answer it. I was holding the baby, and there was a lot of screaming and shouting, and they were screaming that somebody was attacking them and where they were. And so I handed the baby to my wife, jumped in the car, and drove about a 3 or 4 minute drive. And there was a gang of people around this guy, and I had to jump into the middle and pull him in a car and almost speed away. That's the abbreviated version of it. And there was blood running down his face, and I pulled in, and I was mad, and he was really mad, and I called the local Garda station, police station, and told him to get a detective car up, that we were going to have to go in. And I said, what happened? And he said, well, this guy came up and he asked me for a cigarette, and then he just ran away. And then I checked my wallet, and my wallet was gone, so he robbed my wallet. And I said, right, okay. And then what happened? He said, I ran after him and I was screaming at him, and then someone else came out of the pub and saw me and just started hitting me, and then a few people ganged up. And at that moment, then his phone my phone rang, right? And it was this gentleman's father, my friend's father. And he said, is such and such with you? And I said, yes, he's actually sitting beside me. Oh, good. I couldn't get him on the phone. He wasn't answering. Will you tell him that he left his wallet on the table? So we stood the police cars down, and we went our ways. But I think it's not a real life example of how we every day we just get an idea in our head, and we find a way to prove it.
It's a really, I remember the story, and it's compelling. To my students, I used to tell a story I called the monster story. Have you heard it?
No.
It is very similar to yours, but it's a woman who's late for her plane in an airport, and but she's hungry. So she stops by and buy a bag of crisps and something to drink. Then she comes to the gate, and there's time. There's a small table. There's a man sitting there, And she pops down and she opens her bag of crisps, and then she had to go to the toilet. So she comes back 2 minutes later and see the man had dug his hand into her bag of crisps and eats from it. So she demonstratively looked at him and turned the bag towards herself and started eating. And then he turned it back and starts eating. And she just take the bag, look at him and screams, "You fucking monster." And then they call for boarding. So she runs over to the counter, hands over her ticket, but then she looks into her handbag and there's her bag of crisps. It's very similar to your story, but I think it's so fascinating, these fundamental dynamics of how accusations and suspicion arise. And we have to dare to dig deeper into these to understand our job. Yeah. So I couldn't agree more of what the ethos of investigative interviewing really is. I will also ask you, you already told a little bit about your successful introduction with others of investigative interviewing in Ireland, but did you at the time also meet trouble, barriers, problems?
Yeah, I think anybody who is either bringing in or trying to advance something new or something that is seen as new, and I think that comes down to tradition, particularly in police. You have a hierarchical structure whereby something has always been done a particular way. Well, the saying, you do what you always did and you get what you always got. And I guess that could be linked back to my ECI conference when I was asked, are you saying, Adrian, that we were doing it wrong all the time? And then I used to, when we were doing seminars, it wasn't always with agencies. And I remember one particular occasion we were invited into Blackhall Place, which is where near King's Inn, which is where the solicitors and lawyers train in Ireland. And there was a group of 5 detectives chosen to go and do that. It was myself, Adrian Murray, I think it was Peter Woods, Brian Hanley, Brian Quirk. These were all, considered to be the big hitters, and they were. We went in to do a seminar, but I remember one of my superintendents at the time pulling me aside and saying, be careful what you say in here because you don't want to give away tradecraft. My response was that, well, there's nothing to give away. There's only ever been one chapter written on it on the GSIM by Geraldine Noon. There's actually 2 now, Ivar, because I've written one with Becky and Yvonne Daly this year. But I said it's based on the peace model in England, and there are just hundreds of articles and papers and lots of books, and none of this is a secret. None of this is a secret. And you have to take this out of your mindset that we're trying to trick people into saying things to us. It's not about that. It's not about that. And, for me, that's probably an example of some of the barriers that we met with. And then there's another side as well, which is it was really in vogue. In 2016, 17, 18, it was really in vogue, investigative interviewing in Ireland. Everybody wanted to be a level 3. Every SIO, superintendent, detective inspector wanted to have people who were trained in this because the courts were starting to catch on to it, and they were asking for the qualifications of the interviewer. But really, I don't think that a lot of the more senior officers at the time really, really believed in it. They knew that they had to go along with it and to have a certain amount on the books numbers wise. But when it came down to it, I did see it, and I noticed that, and sometimes they would revert back to their trusted disciples, we'll call them, to do the interviews. Because in some investigations, and this was generally not investigations run by level 4s, because when something is run by a level 4, you have 2 level 3 interviewers, you have a level 4 interview advisor. In my experience, they were highly, highly professional. But in other cases, this didn't happen because maybe there was scant evidence, and they were really hoping that there would be a confession. So on one hand, they're supporting investigative interviewing and all that it represents, but in the other, they're putting in somebody that they know will ask tough questions and may get a confession. I've been away from the police for 6 years, but I don't really think anything has changed in that time. I don't think the course has changed. I spoke with somebody recently who trained around the same time I did, which is over 10 years ago, and they still haven't been reviewed. And they've done a hell of a lot of interviews since then. So it is my feeling that by prioritizing new level threes and not putting the time, energy, and money and everything else into the constant training and review of the current level threes, that it's actually a waste. It's a waste of money and a waste of time.
There's one thing I have to be honest with you, and you're not to blame about this, but I've always been fascinated by the fact that I might be wrong. I might be a change recently, but am I right that it's still such that you have to write down by hand in suspect interviews what is said during the interview in Ireland?
Yes, it's actually the basis of my my doctoral research with Becky Millen, and a lot of people find it hard to comprehend. We have in Ireland been audio visual recording since 1997, but we're also mandated to write down everything as per the caution, which states you are not obliged to say anything unless you wish to do so, but whatever you do say will be taken down in writing and may be given in evidence. So this is a real problem. Anecdotally, I sat in interview rooms and it was a relatively good interviewer, I think, and I was able to build relationships and leave my ego at the door, and people would start talking, and I realized that they couldn't keep, the pen could not keep up with the mouth, you know. And there was one particular interview, I give you an example. It was a very high profile interview. It was a murder investigation, and the individual had decided not to say anything, as was his right. I think it was about 30 odd minutes into the interview when he just looked at me and said, "Adrian, you know I was there. You all know I was there, but I can't tell you because at that precise moment, the scribe, or the person who was writing everything down, put the hand up like that and said, whoa, 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 whoa. Can you not see that I have to write everything down?" So this is not the first time this happened, Ivar. If I'm honest, I'll say that I did it at times earlier on in my career.
There are sides to that writing that I think is so fundamentally problematic in the way that when I'm going to tell a story to you and you so demonstrably take control of my story through your pen, it can easily be your narrative that becomes the leading task in that room and that will dominate my memory. And it takes me back to a Swedish researcher called Arne Trankell, and he was observing interviews. He was allowed to sit in police interviews. He was just interested in this dynamics, and he describes that how both individuals in that room all of a sudden might start to lose the grasp of their real story and just dive into that. Now we are both slaves of this task. We have to deliver, and it happens unconsciously because they want to please someone. And it's a good thing amongst humans. I would like to help you with your story. Problem with you as a cop, you don't know the story. I do, but you know what it takes to get this story so that it will fit into what it takes to get a conviction. Could you give a short summary of what you have looked at in your research?
Yeah, happy to. So as we said there, the problem identified was that interviews with suspects are not accurately reflecting the interviews that had taken place. So, you know, the idea really came to me when I was sergeant in charge in the investigative interviewing section, because I was getting interviews sent to me with the corresponding memos, and we were using these to try and test whether these people should be brought into the course or not. But I was able to see that I was watching the interview and then I was reading the memo and realizing that these are not one and the same. So the research question is, to what extent do typed handwritten statements from interviews of suspects accurately reflect what was said in the interviews? So I got 15 interviews, and I think this equated to 26 and a half hours of footage. And then I transcribed each and every one of those. It took me 1.5 years.
Wow.
And just to give you a macro level idea, there was 157,000 words in the transcripts, 157,000 words, but in the statements there were 28,000 words.
Mm-hmm.
In the transcripts, there were 2,667 questions asked, but in the recorded statements, there were 1,244 questions documented. The average mean value of the interview transcript was 43 pages, whereas the mean value of the typed handwritten statement was 11 pages. So the accuracy level was 39%. And this gave 4,000, I remember this, it's a big number, but it was 4,481 omitted items across the 15 interviews. So you're talking an accuracy rate of 39%. Now, there had been some previous work done on this. Becky Millen had done some the University of Portsmouth on witness interviewing, and there had been a very small amount done on suspect interviewing. A lot of the work was done in Sweden on interviews that were typed as opposed to written during the interview. But I used the protocol from Millen et al. 2022 and developed that into a suspect-based protocol. When you look at the research itself and you start breaking it down, we looked at writing speed. So the average writing speed is 30 words per minute. The average rate of speech is between 150 to 200 words per minute. So even if you take the lower level of 150 and divide it by 30, you're at about 20%. So physically and cognitively, we can actually, without interruption, if there was no interruption, we could capture about 20% of what somebody is saying to us. This, even in this conversational speed that we're talking at here. And one of the studies that was done in Sweden by Malch and colleagues, 2018, they came up with a figure of, I think it was 24% of the spoken words were captured, which is close enough to that 20% that, of the possibility. But it was important, that we looked at not just the inaccuracies. That is obviously is a big issue, but it was important to examine the interactional nature or the interactional architecture of the interview between the interviewee and the interviewer, suspect and interviewer, and not just the actual written statement. So from that, it transpired that the interviewers were controlling things. It was interviewer-controlled behavior, and it manifested itself in many interruptions that were designed to stop the person from talking. When you get that, you have to look and say, well, it's not just the information that is captured that is the issue. What about the information that was never captured because of the interruptions? So not only is the actual product not where it should be, the product of the actual statement, but the actual skill level, the process that gets you to the statement is far lower because interviewers are unable to use their skill to build rapport, to ask appropriate questions. Because a lot of this is required, and you're doing a really good job now, is for you to give me the room to think and to talk. But if there's continuous interruptions by the scribe, well then I've seen people literally taking the pen and just dropping it on the table as if to give up. I give up, this is not possible. So it's not just the product, it's the process to get there. What are we not finding out because of that? And it goes back to the original question, the presumption of innocence, and gathering as much information as we possibly can. So the process that we have here is a real problem, and it's something that's on the radar. And I'm told that there's an imminent change in the caution. There is legislation, Section 57 of the Criminal Justice Act 2007. It actually provides for recordings and transcripts to be used in evidence, so it can actually be used. But again, it's come back to do what you always did, get what you always got.
Adrian Gates, thank you for a wonderful conversation. And I urge all our listeners to get hold of that thesis when it's out and read it. I'm going to do it. Thank you, Adrian.
Ivar, my pleasure. Thank you very much.